Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for waiting through the tech delay. I know it was a little bit, but we should still be able to finish in time. So I want to start off by saying welcome. I'm Casey, and I'm the lead Raven for Zoomers to Boomers for 2022. And I just want to give a big thank you to all of our participants for agreeing to participate in our very first roundtable of the year, which is very, very exciting. And also thank you to all of those watching this recording after it's aired. So Zoomers to Boomers is an intergenerational roundtable discussion group that really aims to represent multiple perspectives. There tends to kind of be a gap between the perspectives of the older generations and the youth, and we're really attempting to bridge that and encourage understanding all around. We're really aiming to represent as many perspectives as possible, and that's why we're hosting monthly roundtables on various topics. Our participants today, again, are joining the first roundtable of 2022, which means that it's the first topic we're covering. So for everybody who is interested in participating in a future roundtable, you can still apply if you're interested. We still have plenty of more that we're going to be hosting for the remainder of the year. And the link is in the Ravencore Linktree, which is linktree/the Ravencore. And it's also in our Instagram bio. So to everyone watching who thinks that this may be something they're interested in participating in the future, you still have the opportunity to do that. So in the Ravencore, right now we're focusing on an operation called Mind Over Milk, which can also be abbreviated to OpMom, which is really focusing on the unjust practice of dairy being forced onto students' plates across America at all sorts of different kinds of schools, mainly high schools, which really supports the cruel practices of dairy farming and really increases a lot of food waste. 45 million gallons of milk were wasted in 2019 alone, and students must provide a doctor's note in order to even be able to access plant-based milks. So this is really a huge issue that we're focusing on. So for anyone who's interested in helping on this operation specifically, you can definitely help. Anyone aged 15 through 22 can join as a Raven and join the Ravencore's Raven community, but older folks can still support our youth advocacy in various different ways. And one of those is clearly participating in Z2B roundtables. So again, you can find all the information for that on our Linktree. So now that I have my monologue over, it's time to get into today's roundtable. And just a quick reminder on our rules. I know that we talked about rules a little bit when we sent out the initial information to all of our participants, but we really don't have too many rules. We want everyone to feel comfortable bringing up their opinions and discussing what matters to them. But the rules that we do have are really important. All of you thankfully filled out the pre-evaluation prior to the meeting, so thank you all for doing that. But we also have a few rules for the roundtable itself. Make sure to keep your webcam on and your background noise to a minimum. Be respectful and open-minded. Make sure that you stay calm and understanding to others' perspectives. Also, make sure that you participate, but don't interrupt others. Keep the conversation organic and invite others to share their thoughts. Be willing to listen and understand other people's points of views. Also, don't monopolize the conversation and make sure to give everyone a fair chance to share. And if you're not sure if something you want to say is offensive, please don't say it. Every single question that we have is totally optional for you to answer. You definitely don't have to feel like you're obligated to answer every single question, but make sure that you are sharing any opinions that you do have, any opinions that you want to share with all of us. So for today, for the guiding questions, I'm mainly going to be operating based on the raised hand feature. So if you're interested in answering a guiding question after I read it, raise your hand using the Zoom feature. If you're not sure where that is, it's located if you click reactions, it shows raise hand underneath that. And when you feel like sharing, click on that, and I'll be calling on people in order of when I see that hand raised come up. So for today, the topic is the US government's role in schools. So just a bit of background, the US federal government manages several programs to regulate schooling in America, but the states and localities play a really large role in determining the nitty-gritty details of curriculum. So in this roundtable discussion, we're going to be talking about the proper role of government in the school system, what should government involvement look like, and should it even exist at all? Okay. So now that that's out of the way, it's time for a fun part, which is intros. For this introduction, you're going to be stating your name, age, location, and your involvement in the school system. So I'll just paste that in the chat so you can reference that. I'll go first. My name is Casey. I'm 17 years old. I'm located in Los Angeles, California, and I'm currently a student, a high school student in the school system. I'm actually a rising senior. And so I'll just go based on the order that I see on the screen. So next up is Jenny.
Hi, I'm Jenny. I'm 34 and I am in Indianapolis, Indiana. I am the parent of a soon-to-be sixth grader, and I'm also an adult education literacy tutor. So I kind of get both sides of the schooling system. I currently have a student, but I also teach adults who read below the fifth grade reading level. So have kind of gotten the worst part of the education system. And we're a vegan household. So I have lots of opinions about the food system and all that stuff. So I'm excited to hear everyone else's.
Awesome. Next up, we have Shivangi.
Hi, I'm Shivangi. I'm 17 and I'm in Portland, Oregon right now. And my role in the school system is one of a student. I'm also a rising senior currently. So yeah.
Great. Next is Amelie.
Hi, I'm Amelie. Let me just look at the question. Okay, so I'm Amelie. I'm 16. I'm in Chicago, Illinois. And I am a student about to be a senior.
Great. Next is Rita.
Hi, my name is Rita Moore, she, her. I'm in Portland, Oregon. I was a parent of a student who graduated in 2013 here in Portland. I was a school activist for about 15 years and then was elected to the school board and served from 2017 to 21. I also served on the Legislative Policy Committee for the Oregon School Boards Association.
Awesome. Next is Rick.
Hi everyone, my name is Rick Reynolds. I'm the founder of Engaging Every Student, an organization designed to make the learning process more compelling and meaningful. I've been in education about 30 years, started as an elementary teacher, teaching third grade. I was a technology integration specialist for a number of years at the elementary level, taught high school for 5 years, a year of middle school in there too. So many years in public education. For the last 15 years, I've been outside the system supporting in a non-formal role, developing educational software, creating curriculum and resources focused on environmental education. So that's my primary focus now. So I work with a lot of different partners on programs designed to support service learning and engaging with place-based education. I was a principal for a little while too. At a public charter school. So I had a little bit of experience on that side of things. Found out that administration is not really my favorite part of educating. I like the creative aspects and also working with kids. I still teach part-time with kids just to kind of keep my hand in that. I also serve on the site council of my local elementary school here in Portland, Oregon. I should have mentioned that. And it's Woodlawn School, which I love, and I'm involved in a variety of different volunteer capacities at the local elementary school too. Do I have to tell you how old I am? I just turned 50. I can't believe it, but here we are and still feeling good. I think staying connected with kids and education keeps us young, especially if we're passionate about it, because I do think it's the most meaningful use of our time that we can have. And I'm thrilled to be with you all today. Thanks.
Amazing. Okay, next up is Maya.
Hi, I'm Maya. I'm 19 years old and I'm in the Chicagoland area, not exactly Chicago, but and I've aged out of the school system in 2020, and so I've just been a community member, and I'm still here to share my experiences and what I learned when I was in the school system.
Great. Next, we have Monica.
Hello, my name is Monica Chen, and I'm 32 years old. I'm in Oakland, California. I'm the executive director of Factory Farming Awareness Coalition, and we do outreach in high schools and colleges across the country. I have my master's in education. I looked at the questions today and I was like, oh my goodness, are we going to get into school choice, privatization? There's a lot there, very contentious questions. I taught third grade on the Navajo Nation. So third grade is wonderful, Rick. I have done a lot of work in environmental education and outdoor education, teaching science. And then I also worked in prisons, helping college students there get their AA degrees. And I've just had this rather circuitous journey, but I've been very much involved in the school system. And also, one last note, my journey in the school system was very odd. I went to some public schools, I went to some single-sex schools. I dropped out of high school at one point and started my own school and was homeschooled. I went to Waldorf, so I've done a lot of different things, and I'm really grateful to be here. Thanks, Casey.
Awesome. And last but not least is Mia.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mia. I use she, her pronouns. I'm 19 and I just finished my first year of college. So I'm going into my second year in August or September or whenever I go back. Yeah.
Great. So we're really excited to have all of you here as participants. You all have really amazing experiences that definitely qualify to speak on for you to speak on these topics. Okay, so let's dive right in. The first question is, in general, what role should the government play in establishing guidelines at schools? And again, you can participate by raising your hand, and I'll call on people in the order in which I see that. And I'll put the question in the chat.
Can we define guidelines?
Yeah. So, well, this can really be as vague or as specific as you want it to be. In essence, this question is really just talking about the government playing a role in establishing guidelines, whether that be reading lists, nutritional guidelines, educational curriculums, all of that, really just anything that the government has in terms of regulating schools. Awesome. Maya, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I feel when it comes to the government's involvement and things like that, my biggest issue is with curriculum and a lot of the things that the government can have control over and how it can very easily turn into manipulation of our younger generation. It's very hard for me to agree with one system controlling another instead of allowing for more input from the people who are actually within the school system, like the students and the parents. And I feel that a majority of the time the government silences that and kind of, acts like they know better. But I do believe in, being able to stand up for yourself and speak for your own needs too, and not being told specifically what to do, instead being guided, which I don't feel like it's a guidance right now. I feel like it is a dictation.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Shivangi.
Yeah, so I would generally agree with that, but I think education is such a contentious issue because I remember I've talked to my parents about this before as well. And for people in my community, if they were the ones dictating what I was being taught, I would have full faith that they wouldn't distort history or make the curriculum into distort what I'm being taught. But I feel like if we put control of education in completely within parents' hands, completely within the communities, we're going to see a lot of variation that's probably not going to be helpful when it comes to communities that just haven't been taught I don't know if correct history is the right word, but because there's only one history that can be taught, but I don't know if that's making any sense, but yeah, that's generally where my mind goes.
Definitely. Rita.
This is a complicated question. So I guess I should probably say I'm trained as a political scientist, so that's kind of I want to define what we mean by government. I think it's important to note that we're looking at multiple levels of government around education. Historically, public education was governed at the local level primarily. And then ultimately, the role of the different levels of government expanded over time. So we started off as a local, really local, and then the state got involved, and then eventually the feds. And the federal role in education really didn't take off until about the 1970s. There are good things and bad things about federal involvement. One of the things that we know about the United States is that there have been vast differences in the way state and local governments have treated certain populations. And the role of the federal government in the 60s and 70s was, I think, salutary. We started to get the federal government enforcing desegregation. Supreme Court declared desegregation was the law of the land in 1954. And it took in many places in the South 20 years to actually implement, and even longer in the North, actually. So the role of the federal government has, I think, been vastly expanded over time, and mostly to the good. I have to say that I live in Portland, so you can probably guess what my politics are. And I have to say, my view of the value of federal intervention is very often dependent on what the actual policy is. If I agree with the policy, I think it's swell. If I disagree with the policy, I think it's really pernicious. So, like anything else, the role of any government entity in public education is going to be a little fraught. But I would say, on balance, I think the intervention of the federal government has been beneficial to students.
Hi, all. Sorry for that. Zoom decided to boot me out. But thank you so much, Rita, for sharing. Jenny's next.
I fall kind of in the middle. I agree with everything that Rita said. I mean, our schools wouldn't be desegregated if it wasn't for the federal government. And as she said, it took decades for schools to desegregate. And we saw how hard some of those districts pushed back on that. And I also think of things like ADA compliance, students with disabilities would just probably not be able to go to school in some places. And I live in Indiana, so without the federal government, I fear that some of our schools would be more, rather than science-based, would teach theology, would teach things that I don't want my child to learn. However, I do agree that it depends on the policy, right? There are certain things that I don't agree with. We see school districts trying to ban books that talk about the LGBTQ plus community. We see all kinds of book banning that we know smaller school districts in states, cities would do if the federal government let them. So while I think our federal government does overreach a lot and they don't take things like community, student, family interest at hand, I do think we need some sort of governing body because we're all so different in this country, and we would have pockets of people who got really subpar education. And unfortunately, I think we all know that would probably tend to be minority populations, the poorer populations. And so I very much appreciate that there is some sort of larger entity to kind of keep that in check. However, I don't blanket support total government intervention in the schools. I kind of fall in between, I think.
Thanks for sharing. Amelie.
When I think of the government controlling anything that has to do with school, I automatically think of standardized tests. And I believe that those are very harmful because I mean, I believe they've actually ruined people's lives in some cases, and they're not very much based on evidence, and it doesn't, like, doing well on a standardized test doesn't show all that much. So that's just what my brain jumps to. But yeah, I think that it definitely depends on the policy.
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing that up. Rick?
Yeah, I hear you, Amelie. That's been on my mind too since I first saw this question, this testing thing. And if you talk to teachers now, a lot of them just aren't as happy in education now as they were when I first got into this about 30 years ago. And a big part of that is the overemphasis on standardized testing, in my view. And I think we really need to find that fine line. I also hear what Rita was saying about the role of the federal government has been largely positive, from desegregating schools, like you mentioned, to supporting students with special needs that was mentioned, and a lot of other things. It can be a useful partnership between the federal, state, and local levels. 20 years ago, we got the what I see as kind of an infamous law through at the federal level, No Child Left Behind. And it really did set this up for the overemphasis on standardized testing. The amount of time that schools put into testing is kind of absurd. The fact that they have to do it so many years and for so many hours. I think the balance can be found between, some kind of assessment, and folks can make that good case that it's good to kind of check in and see where the kids are, but nowhere near the amount of time that's being put into it now. What we see in schools, and I'm still in different schools on a regular basis, is that very little time goes into things like science and social studies now. They have this big reading block, they've got the big math block, maybe they got the other reading block again later, and it's all designed to see how we can get the students the best test scores, really. And unfortunately, in the vast majority of cases, and I think that's especially true in schools that maybe are poorer and have less resources, and so the kids coming in are coming in, with more to pick up, and so they feel like, oh, we really need to go all in on this reading and math. In my experience and what I've seen in all these years is that it just doesn't work because the kids need to be engaged. That's why I keep my focus on engagement. And I like project-based learning, things that get the kids really fired up to learn. And then what we see, I'm involved in a crayfish study, for instance, with the National Park Service and a bunch of other partners. And we get students out looking in their streams, seeing what crayfish species are there, sending in the data. It connects to salmon and other important things that are out there, and the students are really fired up. So, for example, I've worked with my neighborhood third graders, and these third graders can read really high level stuff, even though they're not supposed to be performing that great. If you just kind of look at standardized testing or whatever, when they're engaged, when they're excited about it, then they will just intrinsically have that motivation to learn, and that's what really helps bring that achievement up. I think educators need to have these high expectations that we want the students to be able to read at grade level or above, and do math and these other things. But how we get there is really important. And I think as long as we keep that kind of overemphasis on the standardized testing, it's just not going to go where we want it to go. We've had 20 years now of that, and we just haven't seen the kind of gains that were hoped for by George Bush and other people that pushed that. And so I would personally like to see us go back more to some involvement from the feds. They certainly need to send money down to support things like special education, but a lot less in the form of telling schools exactly what should be done. Let teachers be creative. Teachers are the most important part of the equation. We have a lot of data about that, and so teacher training is important. Hiring really good teachers is important, and then supporting them. And you can see it in places like Finland and other places where they do this, where teachers are treated like professionals. They're not forced to do certain things, and they can focus on just kind of caring about their kids and supporting them, and that's where the magic happens. Anyway, sorry to talk so long.
No worries, great points. Okay, Monica.
Thanks, Casey. I think that it's important to recognize the history of education in the United States. Maybe a book that some folks might want to read is from John Taylor Gatto, The Underground History of American Education, because I think it does provide really good framing for why we have a lot of the subject matter that we have, why we have the schedule, why you're even like sitting in your schools and having the experiences that you all are. Education is primarily a state and local responsibility in the United States. And I think that that was very intentional. And there have been some moves by the federal government to do exactly, what many of you are seeing as very needed, right? Because there was a recognition of some of these discrepancies in terms of the value of the education a student was receiving based on location, income, community, and race. What I find is that because we struggle so much with figuring out how to support students, we end up in these like very specific debates. So around 2000, somebody can help me out here, around 2012-ish, I remember we were shifting to the Common Core, and that was really contentious. And the idea was actually pretty simple. It was, or the reasoning behind it. There was a student in New Mexico. That student then travels to Indiana their sophomore year of high school. They might be receiving completely different curriculum. It might not be all related to what they were doing before. There needed to be some kind of consistency. In reality, what that looked like was some states had better standards already. So there were some students that in a state like California that had wonderful standards, arguably, that shifting to Common Core wasn't a good thing. There were major problems with implementation. I can tell you that as a teacher within the Bureau of Indian Education, which is housed in the Department of Interior, it was so rapid for us, any type of thing that the Department of Education wanted us to do. And it was a hard shift for all of us. I did teach to the test. There was a lot of emphasis on testing that is exactly what Rick was talking about. And I'm no longer a teacher in the classroom, so you can imagine the impact that it had on me as well. I think that what I've learned is that there are going to continue to be some things that we debate on, because I do believe that people on many different sides actually do care about students theoretically. And what we have trouble recognizing is that there are certain things that we just know help. Like I would argue that things like having library, having recess, like basic things that we all just know, but those things sort of just go away with, an emphasis and a singular vision on like, we need to have Common Core. We need to make sure that all students are at a certain reading level by the time they finish third grade. So I try, whenever I find myself in these really long debates about privatization or something like that, I try to focus on what we know does help. Smaller class sizes helps. Is it the end all be all? Will everything be better automatically because of that? No, but you ask any teacher, is it better to have 40 students or 20? They'll say 20.
Really great examples. Awesome. So next, I was going to ask if there was a certain bright line at which government involvement became more harmful or beneficial, but I think we covered a lot of that in the prior question. So does anybody have anything to add on that note? If not, then we can just move on. Okay, great. So then we'll move on to the next part of the question, which is more personal. It's, do you have any personal experiences of government intervention in school policies having a significant impact? Was it positive or negative? And again, this can focus on government at the state level, the local level, or the federal level. Shivangi?
I think one thing that's always been really interesting in my education is my experience as like part of an immigrant family, because my parents were and are still pretty obsessed with kind of recreating the education system that they were raised in, which had a lot of like federal like intervention, because the way things work in India is that like the SAT for us isn't make it or break it, but for my parents, there was one test at they took in 12th grade, and if they did okay, they went to college, and if they didn't, they were kind of screwed. So every single thing kind of became make or break for them. So the translation into America, where there's like so many factors, was really hard. So my entire education at home has been kind of centered around that. But when it comes to government intervention, I can just remember I've had to take a standardized test every single year. And I'm pretty sure every single year my parents have been thinking okay, she fails this, she's dead. It doesn't really matter anymore, especially when it comes to college. So I think when it comes to standardized testing or Common Core, or the words that are generally thrown out when we're talking about standardizing education and making sure everyone receives the same education, all I can keep thinking about is every single student is different, right? Some people just aren't meant to sit in a room for 4 hours and write 15 different essays in an AP exam. I'm fortunate enough to not have anything holding me back from that, but it's not exactly I enjoy doing that stuff either. So I don't think I've ever met a single person who's fit the standard model that the government has set upon the education system. So I think that's one of the biggest issues facing us, which is that no one fits the standard model. The standard model is really not that standard.
Yeah, for sure. It's so interesting to hear about how different education systems are in different countries. So thanks for sharing that. Mia.
Just adding on to that, the standardization of tests and testing, they don't become standard, they're students come from different places, different backgrounds, and in the end, we're not all going to have the same opportunities, the same chances to do well on the SAT or the ACT, you know what I mean? So it's what's even what are we measuring? It's just measuring what resources a student has, what resources that a kid can gain or can pay for or can have opportunities to do. And if the point is to make everything the same, or to make all schools have the same opportunity or whatever, standardized tests are not the answer to that. You know what I mean?
Definitely. Thank you so much. Does anybody else have any thoughts on personal experiences? Rick.
Yeah, one of my experiences along the way that was really eye-opening was when I first went from high school teaching into developing educational resources for this educational software company. And I was creating lesson plans and things that could be used with the software. And I got vetoed a lot on the topics that I wanted to put out there on really basic stuff like Japanese internment. I was not allowed to have an activity that dealt with Japanese internment because that wouldn't fly in Texas and some of these other redder states. A state like Texas has this big statewide adoption. If they say that you can be sold in Texas to school districts, you're golden, because they can basically buy your software or your textbook or whatever it is and have it be out there in a huge way. If they say no, then that basically just kind of kills your product. And they have that power. And we're seeing that with Florida now too, of course, with just saying you can't bring any of these textbooks in, and you ask them why you can't, and the reasons they're giving are really pretty shaky, talking about things like social emotional learning. And so that was very eye-opening to me. I had been fortunate to teach in districts that did respect teachers, and I got to bring in topics that tried to bring in different sides of history, whether it's the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, or is the United States totally good throughout history? These kinds of things that they just, unfortunately, I realized from that job that it just doesn't fly in Texas. And now we're seeing this debate really play out on a national basis. It's kind of incredible to see it just kind of blowing up right now, where these red states and red school districts are basically saying, you can't do certain books. Of course, we've had book banning for a long time, but now it's kind of coming back up to a new level and certain topics. And so that's a role that the government is playing right now that I think is potentially very harmful. And I think things like the Florida law, what we call the Don't Say Gay law, for example, and just trying to take these things out of education that are very important for all students to feel included, and for history and reality to be presented to students. We're not trying to indoctrinate anyone if we talk about positive and negative things that happened in US history, for example. And so without that, I think we really run a very slippery slope, and it's something that I'm very passionate about. I think we are fortunate to live in this long-lasting democracy, but we're only going to be able to keep it unless we can keep students engaged in real issues and thinking about good and bad things that have happened in history and why they need to be engaged. We don't want something like Japanese internment to happen again, and it very easily can if they don't learn about it from history. It's just one example.
Yeah, that's a really great example. Thank you. Rita.
Are you having trouble unmuting, Rita? Oops, darn it all. Just make sign language.
I just clicked ask to unmute, so you should have a button pop up on your screen that allows you to unmute. If that's not working, we can circle back. And if you aren't able to unmute, you could always participate and say something in the chat if you had anything to add there. Okay, Monica.
Oh, Rita, you unmuted.
Oh, yep. I think you're unmuted now.
All right.
Sorry, I've got this perpetually lagging internet here, which usually pops up when I have to unmute. Sorry. So I just wanted to kind of double down on what Rick was saying. The alternative to government intervention is using market mechanisms. And the market can be just as perverse as, a government intervention that I disagree with. So it's really tricky. I'll go back to what I said in the beginning. If there's if the government is enacting policies that I agree with, I think it's a great thing. The problem is that we have I'm a political scientist, remember, we're on a very troubling trajectory here as a country. I always like to say that public education was the bedrock for American democracy. However flawed it was the thing that made the United States the United States. The United States invented public education. It is supposed to be the one place, we used to have service, military service, as one of the great, one of the very few times that you got, generalized, almost universal participation in a single entity. I'm not advocating universal military service, don't get me wrong. But public education was the one place where you were supposed to get sort of, the general population intermingling. So it was a way to overcome class differences and racial differences and family differences and, different experiences being shared among students. It was never perfect, but that was the idea. And in many places, it actually did work. If we're recommending books, Robert Putnam has written a number of things. He's a political scientist at Harvard, and he's written a number of books talking about sort of the change in American society where you no longer have universal experiences. And, his big books is called Bowling Alone. And you increasingly have children being separated out by race and class and location. And it goes against the spirit of American public education. I think much to our dismay. So it's really troubling when I see government intervention being used for really perverse intentions, which is happening in many states. And I see the federal government not intervening as robustly as I would like to counteract that. And then potentially the federal government being captured by the very forces in American society that I think are pernicious. So I am really afraid for public education in America, really afraid. And I think we need to be very active in defending it as a fundamental protection for democracy in this country.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective. Monica.
I understand where you're coming from, Rita. I think that as I've gone older and just started to gain more experiences, it was one thing to be a student and then a teacher, and then to think about things on an even more macro level about like what the alternatives are. But going back to my experience as a teacher and sharing something that I think might be helpful for all of you to know is that when I became part of what was called a turnaround school, which was the new term at the time for a failing school, what that meant for us is that we had scripted curriculum. And if you're not familiar with scripted curriculum, like reading mastery, we would read as a group, the dog is white, like with our fingers, and then I'd have to snap my fingers, like not too high, not too low. I would always get washed. And if I snap my fingers in the right place, it would literally say, I would say, what color is the dog? And the students were supposed to respond white. Like there was that scripted. Response to intervention time took an additional 90 minutes. So in a super long school day, because what we tend to do is just elongate the school day. We were decreasing recess, decreasing lunch. I had to fight for 30 minutes of science per week. Things like PE started to disappear. So I know what it's like to, on the one hand, have this like very macro level perspective of like, what do we do? And also like have that experience of being the teacher. And I again mentioned John Taylor Gatto because he is one of the most celebrated teachers in the history of public education, was New York State Teacher of the Year. And he says he couldn't continue to hurt students any longer. So I do want to recognize that it's been really challenging. And it's not just recently as well.
Thank you for telling us about that experience. Maya.
I also wanted to share like my personal experience because it did occur to me that this happened a long time ago because it has been a while since I graduated. Not really, but it's for me, I can barely remember it because the pandemic was going on. And I remember even before that, before we were completely remote and doing our classes that way, I was struggling so much with the curriculum and just the way the classes operated. And I think a big portion of it was because throughout like my elementary school education, I was in like what they called the gifted program. So if you tested at a certain level on a test in 3rd grade, you are in the same classes with the same people, learning a different curriculum. And that's like the only class in your school that learns those things and learns that way. So then when I went into junior high and high school, we joined the rest of the school population and we were just in honors classes or AP classes. And we were no longer just within our group of 30 kids that we've known since we were like 8 or 9. And it was extremely hard for that entire group of kids, I know. And, you know, my school isn't the only one who had that program. And I hear all the time about kids that grew out of that program and how much they struggle now with motivation and with understanding things, because it might be burnout, or it might be just because of how different or maybe unregulated things were that we were learning in that program, and the switch to the rest of the system was just a lot different. But I do know that when I got like really, really bad, I had to see a therapist, and I actually got recommended homebound, and I was like, basically prescribed that. So, which was, I would just go to school online before the pandemic and everything, and talk to one counselor, and they would tell me things I need to get done for the day. They would tell me things I can go look up to help me. And it wasn't very guided at all. I was really teaching myself for a long time, but I actually like flourished that way. I liked it. I felt like excited to do my work, and I felt like I was actually learning things because I kind of guided what I learned myself. And I don't know, I just hope that one day we can have a bigger emphasis on that in education, because I really believe that the students probably have the biggest insight on what's best for them. And it's just a matter of, sometimes it's tricky for adults to see that maturity in children, or to see that they are capable of having that responsibility. But I know that even looking back at things that I did before, I still see that I always kept my best interest at the forefront. And I know that most students do. And on top of that, they care for their friends and everyone around them, despite a lot of ways that their perception could be distorted as an adult, or by the time that they're an adult. So I just think with my experience, and that probably leads or guides my opinion a lot. But I still fall in the middle. I still can't say for sure. But that's my experience.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. I'm really glad you brought up the gifted program, because that definitely has had an impact on a lot of people. Shivangi.
Okay, let's keep talking about the gifted program, because I think a lot of us here have some opinions on that. When I moved to India, or from India, I've been in 3 different school districts, and in every single school district, I've tested for a gifted program, and I've tested into the gifted program. So since first grade to 8th grade, I was in gifted classes, okay? And the echo chamber we create for these kids is horrifying. I mean, there are a lot there's a lot of other things that you can go through as a child that are worse than being in the gifted program. I'm not saying that being in a gifted program is the worst thing to happen to you, but the utter lack of social skills that occurs within gifted programs, especially in those where you just group 100 kids together and tell them that they're God's gift to earth, and then they're just taught that for 3 years and then dumped into a high school where they are again on their own. I've seen that with all of my friends, and there are a couple things that happen. Either your ego never comes down to earth and you just continue on in your little echo chamber for the rest of your life, or you're just literally sent hurtling back towards earth. And I mean, I cannot begin to describe the amount of harm that the gifted talented program has brought to my life. Just because as a young kid with a malleable mind, when you're told that you're gifted, of course you want to believe that. Or you're like, oh my God, I'm gifted. And then when you grow up and you go to high school and you are either forced to take 5 AP classes a year and burn yourself out to exhaustion, which is the point where I've reached, or you find strength to be like, you know what, maybe I am something without academia. We're seeing burnout that midlife professionals experience in the school system right now. And it just baffles me, because then if we look at the college system, right, I have to be a full-fledged adult to get into anywhere that my parents would think is reasonably good for the family or whatever. So I think for both people inside the program and outside the program, if you're inside it, the argument can be made that you have a better education because of AP classes or whatever. But then if you're outside the system, then it's like, well, I'm at least I'm a normal person who knows how to communicate properly, right? So it's this weird dichotomy. Like the gifted talented program, I'm never not going to hate it. I'm going to be on my deathbed and my last words are going to be, I hate the gifted talented program. And that's how I'm going to end.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much. And I think that the Gifted and Talented program is established on a state level, if I'm remembering correctly. So yeah, definitely really interesting to hear everyone's different experiences based on what states they're from. Amelie.
So I've been thinking a lot recently about like if I didn't have to do certain things, like I didn't have to do certain classes and study for certain things, then what could I have accomplished at this point? And I think this goes back to the idea that humans have to be productive or they need like an incentive to be productive and to do things. And I just don't think that's true. And I think there's a level of that that kind of thinking with school. It's like, oh, if we don't have this standard and we don't have like a failing grades, then people won't be motivated to try their best and to learn. And I just don't think that's how it works. I think it's just natural for humans to want to learn, and it's so much easier when there isn't the risk of failure. And yeah, it's also just standardizing everything can get messy, but there is also like I wonder if it could be made flexible. For example, I took the algebra exit exam before other people took it because I already knew it. And then yeah, I had to teach myself, but at least I got to try and learn something instead of instead of being stuck in a class where I had to listen to stuff I already knew, which is really, really hard. And then yeah, I was learning on my own. There wasn't a teacher there. But guess what? Like I did learn some things because I wasn't just playing video games, like I was trying to learn. And I think people who don't have that motivation either don't care, in which case they wouldn't make it in life anyway, or maybe they do, or they don't know how to care, or they don't think it's worth it, and maybe there's something going on at home or something. So yeah, that's my take.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We're going to go Jenny and then Mia and then move on to the next question.
I really like what Amelie said about being flexible, because I think that is so important for students. So I want to share a little bit about what I do with adult education. So I tutor adults 18 to, I think the oldest one I've worked with was about 80 years old, who read below a 5th grade level. And unfortunately, some of these students do have high school diplomas. So that means they were just pushed through the system without any type of regulation at all. However, what I see with our students is, you know, we were talking about the Gifted and Talented program, and then there's also the other side of it. I think we have kind of this impulsive need to label and put people in groups, and that's really harmful for our students. The adults that I see, they were put in remedial groups. So they've grown up their whole lives calling themselves stupid. I'm too dumb to learn. And so they don't search out education again until they're well into their 40s, 50s, 60s, and they're having trouble keeping a job that can pay a living wage. And so then they come to us and they learn very quickly. Actually, they can learn great. There's nothing wrong with them or the way they learn. They just weren't getting what they needed through their school system. So while to kind of keep it on topic of the personal experience with government intervention, I feel like some of our students either didn't have enough regulation, or the regulation was so much that the schools found a way around it. You know, they had the federal or the state, and then the smaller school districts found a way to leave these students behind ironically under the umbrella of No Child Left Behind, in order to get their funding and just push these students through the system. And then, decades later, they come searching out education and other aspects. So I really think that flexibility in finding better ways and more ways to teach our students, like Rick was saying, we don't teach history and science and those things anymore. And the adults that I work with, they think reading's super boring, and then we put history in front of them and they just light up and they love it. And then they go on to math and they learn better in math because they were focused on something that they actually enjoy and they can connect to. So when it comes to regulation, I think we need regulation, but who's regulating it and what interests do they have in mind? Is it money making? Is it funding? Or are they looking at the whole child and what's best for our students, and then releasing those students to become adults in our community? And so I think for me, it's not the amount of regulation as the motivation behind the regulation sometimes.
Really great points. Thank you. Mia.
This is like totally in the opposite direction of what you were just saying, which I agree with like completely. But just talking about my own experience and my own like high school experience, I went to a private high school, and the last year of, like my senior year of school, my school avenues, it like designates your last year to a legacy project where you get to kind of design your own project, meet with one or two teachers, have weekly check-ins, but really just do what you want, do your own project. And that came with like 4 years of high school where you like have regular classes and you have math and science and, classes. But senior year, like I really got to design my own education, which I feel like made me the person who I am today. I would never be here if it wasn't for my legacy project. I did a project, I was like, I was leadership with another activist organization, and I organized protests and I petitioned and I got the mayor to change something, and it was like really there where my love for learning in like a traditional school setting and like my passions really like married together really well. And I think if there were more opportunities like that, like what Maya and Rick and basically everyone here is saying, where students can really like design their own education within the bounds of traditional schooling and traditional classes, it would be super beneficial. And it landed me here today. And like, if it wasn't for that legacy project, maybe if it wasn't like I designed that, I wouldn't be here. You know what I mean? So it's like kind of those student-driven, student-led learning opportunities and engaging with the real world, which I think are the most effective in terms of like regulation. Yeah.
Definitely, Mia. Thanks for sharing that. Awesome. So with that, we'll move on to the next question. I know that we've covered this already a little bit, but the question is asking, should guidelines for school curriculum be established at a federal level, a state level, or a district level? And should they exist at all? So again, I know we've mentioned this a bit before, but if anyone has anything to add to this discussion, just feel free to raise your hand. Awesome, Rick.
Yeah, I think they can happen at all levels, the school level, potentially the local level, the state level, the federal level, as long as, like you've all said, the motivations are right and the research backs up these approaches. One example is the Next Generation Science Standards. I happen to be a big fan of them. I know people who helped write them, and I write curriculum that's aligned to them. And I think they just are really well thought out, and most states have adopted them, and it really has moved science education in the right direction. When I went through school, and even when I was first teaching, my first job in teaching was actually as a full-time substitute teacher in a middle school. And I would come into this different class every day, and the teacher would have the lesson plan out, And almost always it was terrible. If it was in science, it was like, okay, have the kids read this chapter and answer these questions. Or it was like, have the kids outline the chapter, or just something that was so mind-numbingly boring and just kind of like regurgitating information. And it's just not things that students are going to remember and be able to actually do science in the long term. And so just since NGSS came out, we see a lot more of students doing science and having it be inquiry-based. We talk about phenomena-driven instruction. So you just kind of put out this interesting thing that happens in the world and have students think about it, and then go and do an experience related to it. And then you get to the explain stage later on, where students can also explain while the teacher is filling in some details, but it's a much more like interactive inquiry based, where we're investigating questions. And so I think that's one good example of standards really driving improvements in education. And so one of my roles is helping to train educators to integrate these lesson plans aligned to NGSS and Common Core. So Common Core, as has been mentioned, is very controversial. That's part of what's kind of driven this overemphasis on standardized testing. At the same time, it does have a lot to offer in terms of, if you look at the English language arts standards for Common Core, it's just all these skills that we really want humans to have out there, the ability to give a presentation informed by research, just basically reading, writing, and doing real things, more so than just kind of grammar, which was when I went through school and first started teaching. I remember my student teacher supervisor insisted on doing like lots of time on grammar, and I was just like, oh man, well, we'll do what we have to do. And now there's less emphasis on that in favor of students actually able to write meaningful things and stuff. And so I think in that way too, it's been good in a lot of ways. There is overemphasis on all students having to do certain kinds of math at certain grade levels and stuff, which is very damaging. Who cares if every kid can do algebra when they're, you know, whatever age somebody decides they can do it at. All of the points you made about having more student flexibility are just so important. And I think we can have these standards or guidelines that come down from government at some level, but then there has to be a lot of flexibility in terms of how students are allowed to reach those. And so I could say a lot more about this, but I'll let someone else go.
Definitely love the emphasis on flexibility. Rita.
Yeah, I agree with Rick and pretty much everybody else. I think the Common Core standards were not a terrible idea, but I think were very badly implemented. I think there is some value to establishing some common standards. I mean, one of the things that came out of the No Child Left Behind and all the testing, as there were many terrible things that came out of that. But one thing that did come out was proof positive that generally speaking, we have appalling levels of reading among many, many students, in particular, students of color, poor students living in poverty. And it forced a real emphasis on getting students to read. I think the way we went about it was wrong-headed. I think the strategy that was used was not informed by brain science. You know, I think there is some value to using testing and metrics to evaluate the effectiveness of, you know, whatever it is we're doing, but the emphasis on metrics can be, and I think has been, you know, vastly overused. and has caused real damage to now generations of students. So again, it's one of those, you know, what are we doing and why are we doing it? I think going way, way back when to the beginning, I was a history major in college. Way in the beginning, the function of public education in the United States was to create citizens, people who were prepared to participate in their community. It was intended to be, you know, use what we now call a whole child approach. So you were supposed to be exposed to literature and arts and music and all of those good things that would allow you to develop to your fullest potential. We've lost that. I am old enough. I'm the old person in this room. I am old enough that I remember when not everybody was expected to go to college. That you had education in the trades, you know, hands-on education. Everybody got hands-on. And even if you didn't become a car mechanic, you know, at least if you were a boy, you were supposed to be able to fix your own car, you know, or, you know, you could build your own bookcase, even if you didn't become a carpenter. You could become, you know, this sort of multifaceted human being. And then we got the Cold War intervening, and suddenly, and I remember when it changed. Suddenly we're all supposed to do math. I was terrible at math. I hated math. But by God, you had to do math. And then by God, you had to go to college. And if we could go back to, you know, not even that long ago, you know, 50 years ago, when students were allowed to explore and give an experience, lots of different experiences, where, you know, at least theoretically, the whole child was nurtured, then we'd have a public education system we could be proud of. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but we can all hope.
Thank you for sharing such an interesting viewpoint. We're going to hear from Jenny, then Mia, and then we're going to move on to the next question.
I just, listening to what Rita was saying, made me think about how rapidly the world changes, and therefore our educational needs. You know, as Rita was saying, there was a time where not everyone was expected to go to college. You had trades, you had, you know, labor jobs that paid you well enough to, you know, support a family and have a home and all of that stuff. And so I think some of the problem, not all of it, but some of the problem with our regulation is by the time we come up with a solution, implement it, see its effects, the world has changed again, and we're having to update. And certainly students in school now have a very different experience than even what I had in school, which was a very different experience than generations above me. I had some standardized testing, but I was in high school when No Child Left Behind was implemented. You know, I didn't have police in schools. I didn't have all of these things. So I think some of our problems is just, there's so many, they're so vast that it's almost like a snake chasing its tail. We just can't get ahead of some of our problems. And by the time we realize they're not working, well, we've maybe created a bigger problem.
Definitely, definitely. Mia.
This sort of goes hand in hand with that, but I just want to bring up like sex education in schools, because like I did not get a proper, I mean, I had to like do a lot of research on my own, you know what I mean? And I feel like I was doing like a little bit of quick research because I was like, I don't really even know that much about, you know, like what is what in sex education, but I feel like programs like that where it's like, I don't really have much to add on to that, but I just want to like, yeah, I don't really know where I'm going with this, but I think sex education is really important. And I know like schools, you know, not all schools or not all states are like required to even have sex education. And it's like, that's the type of thing where I'm like, I feel like that should be like a precedent for at all places, you know what I mean? Because I don't know, like that just makes like sense. But I feel like you know what has been said, I feel like there's some things that fall into that category and then other things that like don't fall into that category, but it's super hard to discern like what falls into what category, because ultimately you can be like everything falls into one category and everything falls into the other. And I feel like that's just like opinion driven. So I think it's like really hard to implement like, you know, the federal, state level, district level guidelines, because it's like at the end of the day, everything is left to opinion or like thought or like politics, you know. So it's like how does one discern what goes where? Yeah.
I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah. And then last but not least, we're going to hear from Amelie on this question.
Yeah, I agree. And I've been thinking of this. I guess because sex ed is such a specific class, I do think that class should be standardized in some way so that there can be more just so it stays appropriate and stays where like if there's something that might not be right about it, then everyone sees that and it's not up to a more specific location. Yeah.
Definitely. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, moving on to the next question. This one is specific to attendance. So for a lot of public schools in certain states, government funding is based on attendance and how many students are attending. So do you think this approach is ethical? Shivangi.
I think when it comes to stuff like right now, it might not be entirely ethical because of like COVID, like numerous kids are missing school. But I think unless we change our education system into which it's like a hybrid model where kids are learning both at home, like self-taught, and there's like, you know, education training and career programs, like you're going somewhere to work an internship when you'd usually be in school. Like, unless that's more commonplace, I kind of get mandating attendance, if that makes any sense. Like, because personally in my school, I think a lot of teachers, I find when I talk to them about this, complain about the fact that there's no like, not punishment, I guess, but consequence in place for missing school. So that results in just a bunch of kids not coming to school, and that doesn't exactly help motivation. So it's like this really weird cycle of like there isn't any motivation from students, so there isn't any motivation from teachers, and attendance isn't like really pushed for or can't be enforced, so then students aren't showing up, so then teachers get even more demoralized, and it keeps on going and going and going. So if funding was based on attendance, I feel like that would give schools more of an incentive to place consequences on attendance. But then also, I just know that if that does happen, I'm sure there's numerous examples in which that's been abused. So I don't know. I actually was never aware that you could mandate attendance, but yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. Jenny.
I think attendance policies favor healthy kids. I think there are lots of reasons that kids miss school. Some, you know, sometimes kids just don't want to go to school. Sometimes it's home life, but there's also a lot of kids who have chronic illness, and you know, COVID's a perfect example of that. COVID is also a good example of how an attendance policy might encourage sick kids to go to school and make other people sick, and then you know, effectively harming more vulnerable populations than they are. So while I understand why you want kids in school, you want them there and engaged in a consistent level, because education really needs consistency. I think that making it a factor for funding really leaves behind the unhealthy. I think it can border on an ableist policy.
I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah, definitely. Maya.
I was almost going to say nearly the exact thing because I personally am very affected by that, or was when I was in high school. The reason I had to go on homebound was because I had terrible attendance, and that led to me not paying attention in class, not doing my homework, turning it in, getting terrible grades. But like, I didn't know this at the time because I was a kid, but with therapy and growth, I've, realized I had a terrible relationship with my mother my whole childhood. And my closest sibling in age that lived with me was 8 years apart. So for 8 years, after they moved out of the house at 18, I was just alone with my mom. And the only time that she wasn't home was when she went to work. And that was usually while I'd be at school. So the only time that I could have like peace, truthfully, was when she was at work. And most days I couldn't even get that because I'd still have to go to school and face a lot of challenges that made me mentally struggle there too. So I just took the easy way out and just said I'm not going. And I did get consequences, though, is the thing. Because like I mentioned, I was like a gifted kid. I had these big dreams of going to college and doing getting straight A's and tons of awards, and I lost sight of that. And I gave up. And I don't think that the school system made it easier for me to grab back onto those dreams and aspirations. If anything, I feel like it just made it worse because I felt like I was labeled a failure by being told that if I skip one more day of school, even one more class period, I can't graduate and I can't do anything else that I ever wanted to do, just because of a semester of struggle where I couldn't take it anymore, what I had been dealing with my whole life. And so I really do think that attendance is something that, like, there's so many other things you could base funding off of. Attendance is just not one of them. It's so hard for kids to physically get to schools. From my experience, because like especially like when your parents, especially if you're under an age to be left alone at home or left home alone, and your parents have work schedules and all this, it's transportation, figuring that stuff out can be hard. And I know a lot of kids that I know a lot of friends that they told me in the past, like their parents, sometimes if their babysitter wasn't available to watch them that morning, they're either not going to school or they're being left home alone for hours until they have to go to school. And so it's just something that I don't like the sentiment, because it brings up a lot of memories to me of the struggle and the anxiety and just the overall doom it felt to just go into my school building. And the fact that if I didn't, I felt completely failed at everything. So that's what I feel.
Thank you so much for telling us about that experience. Monica.
Casey, upon reflection around the question, I feel like this is really about inequitable funding. And there are many ways in which I've heard, we can allocate money. What I do want to make clear is that the amount of spending per pupil varies greatly, right? At the state level, right? You can look at a state like New York, over $20,000 per student. Some states, less than $10,000 per student. Within each state, it can vary. It can vary by district, right? Just based on like property values within a community. So I think that that's a big part of this question. And actually, Casey, I'm wondering why you wanted to focus on this particular aspect of attendance, or if this is more broadly just about the inequitable funding that we're seeing. And I should also mention that we have learned that increasing the cost per pupil doesn't necessarily equate into better education overall for the student.
Yeah, definitely. This is a really important question of, inequitable funding overall, but also since just the basic principle of funding being based on whether or not a student is there physically. I know that that's been a contentious issue, so I'm really glad that everyone's brought up their different perspectives and experiences on that topic. It's been really great to hear.
Yeah, and then I guess like the final thing I'll say is it does have real consequences, right? So in Oakland Unified School District, that's really exacerbated a lot of the controversy around charter schools, for example, and having more schools taking away the number of students. Because ultimately it's about, we've decided in our area that we want to make sure that the funding goes to where there are students, which arguably makes sense. So then it becomes a fight over who gets to have those students. And if there are schools that have fewer students, attendance based, whether it's 100% or not, if you only have 100 students at that school, should they still be getting funding, or should we be closing those schools? So that I think is part of the larger repercussion of this discussion.
Definitely. So it looks like we've passed 5:30, so that's the scheduled end time. If anybody has to go, feel free to leave, but we do have another question to get to. So if you guys want to finish discussing this question and then the next question, we can definitely do that. But again, if you do have to go, you can certainly pop off. We have had a really great time having you here. So that being said, Jenny, go ahead.
I just wanted to add that I also think we should normalize mental health days, especially for students. I mean, we're, I guess, really preparing them for the workforce that doesn't normalize that, but I think adults should also take mental health days from work. And I also want to add that we're not a poor country. So we talk about funding like it's finite, but we can fund schools more. We just aren't, right? So when we're talking about the ways we should fund things, I just don't want to get stuck in the, like, we have just this amount of money to give to students and then that's it. Because we can take from other areas like military or, all of these other things. So I think we can fund it all if we had the right people in charge in allocating those funds. So to base it on attendance policy, I feel is like the worst one, because certainly you want to send funding to the students, but I don't think we should be closing any schools. If there's a school with 100 students, those 100 students should get funding too. I think we can come up with the funds for everybody.
Thanks for sharing that. Rick.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that this is just another one of those really tough questions that it's so hard to find the right side of the line and to go down that middle path that I think is probably where it needs to be. On the one hand, we've heard these good stories about how, like, often just requiring school for everybody, for students who are maybe sick or it's just not working for the student can cause a lot of problems. On the other hand, we want the kids in school. We want the funding to go to places where the kids are. And so, where do we find the fine line? In my experience, again, it comes down to the flexibility thing. I think if a student it's just not working in that neighborhood school, there should be some flexibility for them to go somewhere to a different school that works better for them, or to be able to work from home. I think Mia's story is really powerful, and I've seen that with other students too. And I think if we do want to do something where at least a certain portion of funding is attached to attendance, then it should also count if a student is working more independently at home. And I think we've certainly seen with the last couple of years through COVID that there have been a lot of challenges in online learning, but there's also been some progress in terms of having it done a little bit better. And in my experience, it can work fine to have students working more independently. And I know some teachers that are in online schools where they feel like it's working well with their students. And just flexibility. I know that going through school, I often would pretend to be sick and stay home because I was a little bit bored in school. And I think it was Amelie shared, I was always super into reading and learning from the time for as long as I can remember. And if I was in a thing in school where I just felt like I knew it already, I just wasn't that motivated. So I would pretend to be sick and just be home, and I would just read all about dinosaurs in second grade or whatever I was into. Because I remember being in second grade and being yelled at by my teacher because I was sneaking my dinosaur book because I was supposed to be doing this other, Jane Rand kind of book. And I think that's just an example of how broken one size fits all education can be. The kid who's super excited about dinosaurs, like, let him read about dinosaurs. His reading level is going to go off the charts because he's reading these big long words and he's still doing all the things you want to do. But it can't be a thing where we just force kids down this one size fits all curriculum, because that's not how humans are. We're all a little bit different, and we need to listen to kids and hear what they want to learn about, and let them, ask questions and investigate things that matter to them, and maybe are connected to place in their own communities. And those are the stories in education that I think are just really inspiring, and that it can be done. I've seen it. We just need to talk about this kind of stuff. And I so appreciate the conversation, because I think if people engage in these questions more, then we have a chance of getting to a more student-centered, holistic approach to learning that actually works. Because right now it's just not working, in my opinion. So let's look at things, research-based. If you think a certain thing, you better back it up with research, or at least really good anecdotal stories if you want to get it to fly. You can't just say, we're not going to teach Japanese internment just because you don't like it or something. Anyway.
For sure, definitely. And next we're going to hear from Mia, and then we'll move on to our final question.
I was listening and I kind of lost my train of thought, but I think on the flexibility aspect, it's really hard. I would say it really depends on like your grade, you know what I mean? Because I can't really imagine, elementary school kids being like, I'm gonna start on whatever, and I feel like there needs to be more. This is not on attendance at all, but sorry. But I feel like it, with aging up, you get more accountability and more responsibility and more like autonomy in your education, at least like in the ideal place. That's how I would do it. In kindergarten and first grade, you kind of have your basics where maybe attendance is really, really important because you're learning the fundamentals, you're learning the basics, you know what I mean? And if you miss a couple of days of school and you miss a week, you're gonna be behind in your class in such a small, element, like in little ages. But in it, like what Rick and basically what everyone else was saying, like when you get older, you have more accountability and you have more responsibility and you have more, love for learning in a different way than you do when you're younger. So then maybe attendance doesn't need to be as doesn't need to be a strong, I'm losing my words, but it doesn't need to be like the end all be all of, if you do well in school, because you have this love for learning outside of the mold of traditional education. So yeah, maybe a model like that would work better than, attendance is the end all be all, and we're gonna allocate funds to the people who would show up to school, like everyone else was saying.
For sure. Awesome. And then lastly, we have our final question, which is really linking the topic of this roundtable as a whole to our current operation that we're focusing on, which is tackling milk in school cafeterias. And the question is, how does this government regulation that we've discussed relate to school lunches? Jenny.
Well, I think that goes back to the motivation behind the regulation. I think our school lunches are determined by lobbying in certain industries that sink money into our Congress. There's been lots and lots of studies done about what's the most nutritional food, what makes for a better learning day. And I think we all know the story about when the government decided pizza was a vegetable. And I think that really is kind of the thing that shows us what's really behind their motivations there. And it's whoever gives them the most money or however much money they can save. And to your initiative about dairy milk versus plant-based milk, we know many, millions, tens of millions of Americans are lactose intolerant. That tends to be mostly non-white people as well. So to not provide plant-based meals, especially just milk I think speaks most to dairy lobbying and how much money they've given our government in order to re-up and roll back some of the Obama era things that administration did for school lunches to make them healthier, less cholesterol, less sugar, all those things. And those things have recently been cut back in order to move more dairy milk into schools when children aren't wanting it, families aren't wanting it, and it is not proven to be the most nutritious or healthy choice.
For sure. Shivangi.
I think one of the biggest things for me when it comes to school lunches is just like the climate impact. I think the food industry in general should be a whole hell of a lot more farm to table than it is right now. Because if I sourced like a standard school lunch meal, I don't know how much of it would come from Oregon farms, and I live in Portland. So I think if anything is going to be dictated by individual schools, I think it should be food. Because I mean, it's kind of ridiculous to think that like a Congress member in DC who's probably never spent any time in my school district knows more about the type of food that their students eat more than my principal would, or the cafeteria workers in my school would. I think out of all the things in the school system that need to be local, the thing that makes the most obvious sense has to be food. And the carbon emissions that we cut, even if milk was still provided, would be huge because of all those like the CO2 that we're cutting out, because we're not shipping food cross country anymore just because we can and just because we're paid to, basically. So yeah, I think if anything is going to be local in the school education system, it has to be food.
For sure. Monica.
I spend a lot of time thinking about this and the National School Lunch Program. Again, I know that there are a lot of theoretical good intentions. I want to share one quick story, which is when I taught on the Navajo reservation, all my students were lactose normal, lactose intolerant, whatever term you want to use. And I did have to do cafeteria, and I did have to tell the kids that to open their milk. I would get in trouble if when I was doing cafeteria duty, I didn't have the kids open their milk because I was told by my principal that we wouldn't get our funding. And that had enormous consequences for my students because I was in a portable. It smelled really bad. The students always had to go to the bathroom. They were missing on learning time. We didn't even provide water as an option. We had one water fountain for the entire school to use during breakfast and lunch. So I have thought a lot about this. I know that dairy consumption has gone down in the United States, and because the U.S. dairy lobby is so strong, the government is purchasing it and dumping it onto our schools. I've thought about what we can do to address this. I've learned about how it's different districts deal with like scratch cooking versus heat and serve and what's actually available to all of us. To me, this question isn't even really about like the government at this point, because I feel like the government could go in any direction based on the lobbies. It's been a really big challenge for us to support our students with healthy and nutritious meals. At this point, my stance is we just need to make it as inclusive as possible. And so that's why when I'm talking about dairy, I talk about exactly what has already been said, which is that many students are not able to consume dairy products. And I feel like that's where we'll have the strongest message.
For sure. Thanks for bringing that up. Maya.
I was just going to say, I agree. I believe that the forefront of why dairy shouldn't be served to students is because it's harmful to the students. Like, firstly, I feel like it directly harms them. But just beyond that, I'm gonna keep this short, but I started eating plant-based when I was 14. I still ate like cheese and dairy though, but I remember I would get so excited to tell everybody, all my friends, about the stuff I was learning and the good stuff I was trying and all these cool things. And I bring my lunch to school and I'd get made fun of. And I'd also, like, even in the kids who did agree with me or, you know, had some insight in what I was talking about, they weren't able to try it for themselves unless they were to bring their own lunch from home, which isn't acceptable to all kids. And I don't know, it just made me very defeated growing up. And a big thing that I've been saying a lot is I felt silenced. I felt really repressed because I felt like I was the only one who cared about an issue that I felt was so big and grand and affected everyone in such a detrimental way. And I just wasn't being heard at all. And I think it's more clear to me now that that's because it's a lot bigger than me. They probably get more out of serving that to students than they get from hearing me bitch about it. So
Really great that you mentioned that, for sure. Rita.
One of the things I learned when I started working on the school board was how complicated the federal regulation is around school lunches and school breakfasts. It is just astonishingly complicated. And it's also vastly underfunded. So I was just looking up the federal free lunch subsidy is about $3.32. For breakfast, it's $1.88, which is not a lot of money. And it's not going to go as inflation increases. School districts are going to be really strapped. One of the things that the COVID pandemic showed was how many students are dependent on food from schools. How many students have school food as their often primary source of nutrition. And it was finally recognized by the feds, where they suspended the regulations around who can qualify. So school districts were able to offer lunches and breakfasts for the entire school without worrying about eligibility. That's now been suspended because COVID's over, as we all can see, as people are falling over. But it's the complexity of the federal subsidy system is really, it's wrongheaded in my view. One of the biggest issues is that it establishes eligibility based on the federal poverty line, which is at least 30 or 40 years out of date, as it is just absurd in terms of how low it is in determining the poverty level of a family. So we have many students who I think should qualify, but who can't because of the vastly outdated formula that the feds use. And my personal opinion, this is one of those areas where we really ought to be investing, because a student who's hungry can't learn. If we actually care about student learning, this is one of those things that we really ought to be spending money on. And most school districts are underfunded as it is, and providing food is considered to be kind of an add-on service. So most school districts are really strapped, and when you've got $1.88, you're going to go with what you can afford. And it's generally, I want to say crap, but it's generally not the highest nutrition. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement around federal nutrition policy in schools. And I think it's a great thing that you're engaging with that. I would encourage you to go beyond milk. I think there's a lot that can be done to make school nutrition more nutritious and universally available. We have to stop stigmatizing children who are living in poverty. The quality of the food will improve if everybody eats it.
So true. Next will be Rick, and the last person we'll be hearing from after that is Mia.
Yeah, thanks everybody for your good points. I agree with everything that's been said, and I really appreciate this initiative that you're taking to go after milk. I have a very complicated life experience with milk. As a kid, I really loved it, and cheese and pizza was my favorite food, and I would drink like a half gallon of milk a day because I was taught that it was healthy. And, I wanted to be strong, and macho as a 14-year-old swimmer. And so I just thought you should drink a lot of milk. I also used to get sick a lot. I mentioned that I would pretend to be sick sometimes so I could sit at home and read the book I wanted to read. But I also actually did have a lot of viruses and stuff. I've since learned, since I stopped drinking milk when I was 18, that you can be a lot healthier if you don't consume dairy products. My story is I went off to college, the University of Connecticut, and I was doing well. I loved it. And I suddenly started getting really sick. Like I broke out really bad. I had these other just kind of intestinal things. Like I just didn't feel good all of a sudden, and couldn't figure out what it was. Finally, I started cutting foods out, and I realized, oh my gosh, I'm allergic to dairy, like the thing I drink every day at every meal. And my body basically got to the point where it didn't want the casein anymore, the protein that's in milk. And so as soon as I cut that out, I was healthy. My face cleared right up and I felt much better. I almost never get sick. I haven't been sick in many years. And I really attribute a lot of that to not having dairy products. It interferes with the immune system for one of the problems. And of course, we've talked about factory farming too, and just how bad factory farmed milk is in lots of ways for the planet and for people. And so I think we really need to get rid of that requirement. It's ridiculous. And I think we should have alternatives. And I think to Rita's point, this should go beyond just dairy and milk. Why can't vegan options be available to every kid in every school? And it's a healthy way to go that's much easier on the planet, and it's quite affordable to do, like brown rice and beans and a vegetable, like have that as an option. I mentioned I was the principal of a school for a little while. It was a school called the Village School in Eugene, Oregon. And we had a really model food program, all local food. We grew a lot of it in our garden, as much organic as we could. It was all vegan. Those kids were darn healthy, and everybody really loved eating our lunches and also breakfast. We would provide the breakfast for kids too, and we just prioritized that. We were awarded with a first prize sustainability award from the EPA and other groups for that initiative. And I think that there are certain model programs that can be replicated, and it costs us a little bit more, but not a lot more, because meat and pizza and all this prepackaged crap actually costs real money too. And so I think this is a worthwhile initiative, and you should go all in on it. And I will be here to help you. Let me know what else I can do to write letters or whatever, because it's nuts that we force kids to open up milk that can make them sick. We shouldn't allow that.
Definitely. And thanks for sharing such interesting stories. And last but not least, Mia.
I feel like I'm always the last one, but it's okay. I agree with all of you. I second all of this. I would just say one additional point is the waste that school lunches or schools have, because again, this is a single point. Wait, just put it in your minds. But so much waste is produced by schools, and I was just talking to my mom, who is a kindergarten school ESL school teacher here in Brooklyn, and she was saying how the vegan program that the mayor instituted, so every Friday it would be a vegan meal, all of those meals would get thrown away. It was COVID time, they were eating classrooms, and no one would want to eat them for whatever reason. But it's the amount of waste that's produced by schools in terms of food, when things Shivangi, you were saying like locally grown stuff and like more connection to the food, like that could be an easily implemented solution. You're more likely to eat the food if you know where it comes from, if you're invested in it. And while that is like a kind of idealistic point of view, because not everybody can grow their own food, at least like in the system that we have right now, I feel like that would be a great opportunity for students to like, one, learn where their food is coming from, and then appreciate the plant-based options they have more, instead of having, these plant-based meals just served to them, and that's not what they're used to, so of course they're not going to eat them, like, especially if they're not good. Like, we all want good plant-based options when the alternative is like pizza, which is like the yummiest food in kids' minds. Like, I was younger, I was like, yes, pizza, for school lunches. So I feel like, although the solutions or whatever I'm saying is probably idealistic right now, I feel like if those things were to be implemented, students would appreciate their food more. They would eat more of their food, which means that their carbon footprint would be reduced, the waste would be reduced, and they would be getting more healthy lunches. So like, all of those things in combination, I know is like kind of far-fetched, but if we can get there, I feel like lunches and food in school can be like have such more of like a positive impact than a negative one, and a wasteful one, and a consumer one. You're giving and taking in like an equilibrium, which I think is what we need for school lunches. That was a little roundabout. But yeah.
There's really good vegan pizza too, right? We don't have to push the dairy stuff.
Oh my God.
On.
Of course. I'm just saying, like, I
Right.
feel like food given to public schools when they're vegan is not, it's not the food that like I love. It's not the good, my mom's right here. It's not the good vegan pizza, it's like the like starchy rice, the like dried out beans and stuff like that. Like, if I were to become vegan right now, I've been vegan for a long time, but like, if I were to become vegan right now and I only had those options, of course I wouldn't want to be vegan. Like, if that's what's available to me, why is that gonna like, I don't know. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Thank you so much, Mia, for sharing that. And with that, that brings our roundtable to a close. Thank you so much for everyone who participated. You all did a really incredible job. And I'm really grateful that we had such an awesome group of participants in our first roundtable. And yeah, before we end, does anyone have any final thoughts or ideas or opinions that they'd like to share before we close? Sure, Amelie, go ahead.
Yeah, the last thing I wanted to say, I just wanted to clarify something I said earlier about sex ed and how it should be appropriate. I wasn't referring to teaching about gender and sexuality. I think it's fine to teach those. What I was talking about was more just like teachers being appropriate and not creepy. That I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, for sure. That definitely makes sense. Rick?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo the comment in chat. This was a phenomenal discussion. I really enjoyed talking to you all. So many good ideas. It's so important to think about these issues. And I think we need a lot more of this kind of thing, just talking about what matters and spreading these good ideas out there. They won't spread unless we do stuff like this and talk about them. You all, the younger generation coming up, really can change the world, and I already see it with the climate activism that I'm very inspired by, and I think this vegan activism and the other things we're talking about really can have a huge impact, and all this really matters. I enjoyed it. Thanks.
Definitely. Thank you, everyone. And it is really important that we all have a safe space to talk about and share opinions and all of this, especially between generations. So thank you, everyone, for helping us make that possible. And for anybody watching, again, who wants to get involved, apply to Zoomers to Boomers. There's plenty of space for you to be in a future roundtable. And the link for that is in our link tree in our Instagram bio, or just linktree/the Raven Corps. And thank you, everyone, for watching. And just always remember to be respectful in all discussions. And your opinion is valid and so necessary in all of these spaces. And for all of our participants, I will send out a post evaluation after the roundtable, so just keep an eye out for that. But thank you so much again. You're all incredible, had such great perspectives and opinions, and this has been a great time. Thank you so much.